The sound of the sewing machine carried through the afternoon hours in a particular rhythm that had nothing to do with the outside world, a rhythm that belonged only to the work being done. It was a sound that could be heard from the street if you passed the house, a sound that seemed to announce to the neighborhood that work was happening, that something was being made, that skill was being applied to the transformation of cloth into something finished and wearable. Miss Evelyn's front room had been converted into a workspace years before I knew her, had been transformed from what was probably once a formal living room into something more practical, more useful. A large table dominated the space, the kind of table where fabric could be laid out and cut, where patterns could be arranged, where the work of seamstressing could happen in a way that required room to move and space to think. A dress form stood in the corner, a torso without a head or limbs, wearing whatever dress was in progress, a model that could show what something would look like on an actual body. I was maybe 10 years old the first time I went to Miss Evelyn's house with any real intention of learning something. My mother had a dress that needed to be altered, and instead of taking it to a tailor downtown where it would cost money we did not have, she took it to Miss Evelyn, who did alterations and sometimes made dresses for people in the neighborhood. Miss Evelyn was a woman who must have been in her 60s, though age was hard to determine with certainty. What was certain was that she had been doing this work for a very long time, that the skill lived in her hands in a way that suggested decades of practice. The house itself smelled like fabric and thread and the particular mustiness that accumulates in spaces where cloth is stored. There were bolts of fabric stacked in one corner, fabric that Miss Evelyn had collected over years, fabric of different colors and patterns and weights. There were spools of thread arranged in jars, thread in colors that seemed to match every possible fabric combination. There were scissors of different sizes, needles, bobbins, buttons in a tin, elastic and trim, and all the small materials that went into the construction of a garment. Miss Evelyn examined my mother's dress with the focused attention of someone who had learned to see fabric in particular ways, to understand how it was constructed, to know what would be required to alter it. She did not talk much while she examined it. She simply looked, turning the dress over, checking the seams, understanding the garment completely through this visual inspection. Then she explained what needed to be done, what it would cost, when she could have it ready. The conversation was brief and practical, conducted with the efficiency of someone who had had this same conversation many times before. But something in me was caught by the space, by the work, by the way Miss Evelyn moved through her domain with such authority and confidence. I asked my mother if I could stay while she worked, if I could watch. My mother agreed, understanding perhaps that I was interested in something, though she did not say this explicitly. She simply left me there, left me in Miss Evelyn's care for an hour or so while she went to do other errands. That first afternoon, I sat on a chair in the corner of the room and watched Miss Evelyn work. She measured the dress in a particular way, marking the new hem length with pins. She sat at her sewing machine and began to remove the old hem, using a small tool to pick out the stitches that held the old fabric in place. The work was meticulous. Each stitch was removed carefully, the thread pulled out so that the fabric underneath was not damaged. It would have been faster to cut the thread, but Miss Evelyn did not cut. She picked carefully and methodically, understanding that the fabric was valuable and was not to be damaged. Once the old hem was removed, she measured again, more carefully this time, pinning the new hem in place. Then she sat at the machine and sewed, the needle moving in quick, even stitches, the rhythm of the machine creating that particular sound that I had heard from the street. The work was done with confidence, but also with attention. Miss Evelyn was not rushing. She was doing it right. When the hem was finished, Miss Evelyn pressed it with an iron, using steam to set the stitches and to remove any wrinkles. The dress looked new, transformed from something worn and slightly shabby into something respectable again. My mother would be pleased. The dress would serve her for more time yet. I must have asked if I could come back, or my mother must have arranged it, because I began to visit Miss Evelyn's house regularly after that. Sometimes I came with my mother when she had work to be done. Sometimes I came on my own, with the understanding that Miss Evelyn was willing to have me there. She did not treat me as an interruption. She treated me as though my presence made sense, as though I belonged in the space, as though I might be interested in learning. The learning did not happen through formal instruction. Instead, Miss Evelyn simply worked, and I watched. And gradually I began to understand things about the work through the watching. I learned about different fabrics, about which ones were easy to work with and which ones were tricky, about how to tell the grain of the fabric, about how fabric had to be handled differently depending on what it was made of. I learned about patterns, about how a dress was constructed in pieces that were then sewn together into a coherent whole. I learned about the mathematics of sewing, the way that everything had to line up, the way that seams had to be consistent, the way that small mistakes could create problems that were difficult to fix. I learned about the vocabulary of sewing: seam allowance, grain line, bias, notch, dart. Miss Evelyn would use these terms as she worked, and gradually their meanings became clear to me through context and through seeing them applied. One afternoon, Miss Evelyn handed me a needle and thread and asked me to help her. The work was simple, attaching buttons to a shirt, but it required precision. She showed me how to thread the needle, how to tie a knot at the end of the thread, how to bring the needle up through the holes in the button and back down, creating stitches that held the button securely to the fabric. The stitches had to be even. The button had to be secure but not so tight that it was impossible to use. My first attempts were clumsy. The stitches were uneven. The thread sometimes tangled. But Miss Evelyn did not criticize. She simply showed me again, demonstrated the motion with her hands. "Let me try again." "Slow down," she said. "You don't have to rush. The work takes the time it takes." Over months and then years, as I continued to visit Miss Evelyn's house, I began to do more complex work. I helped her pin patterns to fabric. I helped her cut out pieces, learning to follow the pattern lines precisely, to make sure the scissors were sharp enough to cut through the fabric cleanly without dragging or stretching. I learned to sew straight seams, to backstitch at the beginning and end of seams to secure them, to use the presser foot guide to keep the seam allowance consistent. I learned through doing these things that sewing required both precision and flexibility. You had to follow the pattern, but you also had to understand the fabric and be willing to adjust if something did not seem right. You had to be able to see how something would look before it was finished, had to understand the relationship between the pattern and the finished garment. You had to have patience. You had to be willing to do work that was meticulous and sometimes tedious because the result was worth the effort. What I did not fully understand at the time was that Miss Evelyn was teaching me something about economic self-sufficiency, about the way that women in our community maintain themselves and their families through skill and through work that was undervalued by the mainstream economy, but was essential within the community. Miss Evelyn did not charge much for her work. People paid her what they could afford to pay, but her skill was valuable, and the community recognized it and used it. I also did not understand that Miss Evelyn was teaching me something about being a woman, about what it meant to have a skill that was yours alone, that belonged to you, that could not be taken away from you. Her skill as a seamstress was her own. She owned it. She made her living through it, or at least a part of her living. She had independence through that skill, a kind of autonomy that was not available to many women, especially not to Black women during the time when I was growing up. There was something else that I came to understand through my time at Miss Evelyn's house, something about the relationship between her and me that was not stated, but was communicated through the work. She was teaching me not just sewing, but also something about how to move through the world. She was showing me through her example that a woman could be competent, could be skilled, could work with her hands and create things, could have mastery over a craft. She was showing me that this kind of work had value and dignity. The first time I actually made something for myself, a simple skirt from a pattern that I had picked out, I understood something about the satisfaction of creating something useful from raw materials. The fabric was not expensive. The pattern was simple, but I had made the skirt myself, had cut it and sewn it and finished it, and it fit me and looked good and was something that I had created with my own hands. The satisfaction of wearing something that I had made was different from the satisfaction of wearing something that had been bought or given to me. Miss Evelyn praised the skirt in her understated way. She noticed details, the evenness of the seams, the way the hem was finished, the way I had managed a particular tricky part of the pattern. She did not gush or overpraise, but I understood that she was genuinely pleased, that she saw in my work the evidence that I had learned something, that I was beginning to understand the craft. By the time I was a teenager, I had spent so many hours in Miss Evelyn's room that it felt like a second home. The particular smell of the space was familiar to me. The arrangement of materials was something I understood. The rhythm of the work had become something that felt natural. I could thread a needle without thinking about it. I could see a garment and understand how it was constructed. I could estimate, with reasonable accuracy, how much fabric something would require. But I also noticed, as I got older, something about the way that the world was changing in relation to this kind of work. Stores were appearing with ready-made clothes that were cheaper than Miss Evelyn's prices. The skill that she had spent decades developing was being undervalued, made to seem less necessary. Young people, I could see, were not interested in learning to sew the way that they might have been interested in previous generations. The knowledge was being lost, or at least being transferred less regularly. Miss Evelyn did not talk about this directly, but I could sense her awareness of it. She continued to work, continued to do her craft, with the same attention and care that she had always given it. But there was perhaps a slight shift in her attention toward me, a slight increase in the time she spent explaining things, a slight emphasis on making sure that I understood not just how to do things, but why they were done in particular ways. I did not become a seamstress. That was not the path that my life took. But the knowledge that Miss Evelyn gave me stayed with me, the ability to sew, the understanding of how garments were constructed, the knowledge of fabrics and thread and the small materials of craft. These things remained. And more importantly, the understanding that I carried, the knowledge that a person could master a craft, could work with skill and attention, could create something useful and beautiful with their own hands. This understanding shaped how I moved through the world. When I was older, I would sometimes make clothes for myself or for my family. I would understand, as I did this work, the hours of skill that went into professionally made garments, the knowledge required to make something that fit properly and that was durable. I would think about Miss Evelyn, about her steady hands and her quiet authority, about the way she had shown me that this work mattered, that it was valuable, that it was worth doing well. The craft itself became, for me, a kind of meditation. When I would sit down to sew, my hands would know what to do without my mind having to direct them. There was a kind of peace in the work, a kind of presence that sewing required, and that was difficult to find in other parts of life. The repetitive motions, the focus required, the slow transformation of materials into something finished and useful. All of this had a quality that was calming and grounding. I think now about what would have been lost if Miss Evelyn had not been willing to teach me, if she had not opened her space to a young girl who wanted to learn. The knowledge itself would not have disappeared. People would still know how to sew. But the particular way that she understood the craft, the particular approach that she took, the particular standards that she maintained, these things might have been lost if there had been no one to pass them on to. I think about the way that knowledge like this is transmitted in communities, how it moves from one person to another, not through formal education, but through presence and observation and gradual participation. I think about how much of this kind of knowledge has been lost, how much continues to be lost as people move away from the old ways of doing things, as they embrace the convenience of ready-made goods, as they lose touch with the skills that their parents and grandparents had mastered. What Miss Evelyn gave me was not just the ability to sew, though that was part of it. She gave me an understanding of what it meant to be skilled, to have mastery over something, to know how to do something well. She gave me the knowledge that work done with attention and care has value, that the satisfaction of creating something with your own hands is not something that can be easily replicated by purchasing something ready-made. She gave me the example of a woman who was independent, who supported herself through her skill, who had authority over her own domain.